We have a question from Eddie Prather over at Ad Free Shows. He asked, when you started working for WCW, how hard of an adjustment was it for you to go from the European style of how they did things to working the WCW style?
Okay. First of all, let's get this styles thing out of the way.
I had a feeling this was
It's
coming. Yeah,
it's
go ahead.
it's a load of nonsense. Wrestling's wrestling. It's just depending how well you've been taught or where you've been. I've been all over the world before I got here, and I never had any problems wrestling people that had come into this job either before or in the 80s, because it used to be where, and I want to make sure everybody understands that this is no knock on anyone. But it was just a different world then. And the only way to get into this job then in the 80s until the early 90s was to find a wrestler to bring you in to the wrestling business. There was no such thing as wrestling schools, or there may have only been one or two. There was none in Britain. There was none in Britain until after I'd left Britain. You had to find a wrestler to bring you into this, or a wrestling company. And if I was wrestling anyone who was from the 80s who understood, because don't forget, if you went from territory to territory in America, every place had a bit of a different thing going
They
on.
were all different. Yeah.
They were all different.
Yeah, very
And
much.
you went to Japan, or you sometimes went to Europe, or there was Europeans coming into America, into your territories, or there was Japanese guys or people from it. So you had to just figure the universal wrestling or language of wrestling. If I turn your arm that way, your body goes that way. If I put an headlock on, it affects this. And that was a common sense thing. In the early 90s, wrestling schools became a thing. So this is no knock on any wrestling school, but you're getting taught by somebody who teaches you in 12 weeks or whatever you get taught a somewhat whatever skill set they choose to teach you. So you are more prone, or you continue to be, of trying to figure that out. Well, it was getting less and less. There was getting less and less territories where you would go and wrestle different people every night and have to figure out, because it was a matter of survival. If you weren't of a certain standard, you'd get fired.
Right.
So you had to adapt. You had to learn to adapt, and you had to learn to react as well. And I'm not a fan of the word selling. Selling is something that is used in wrestling, but what it comes from is really, it's how you learn to start. You start by selling, but the good people that I know from years ago and to this day, they learn to react. When you learn to react and not sell, because selling is acting, your stuff starts getting better. But very few people get that opportunity anymore, because there's not as much, you're not getting 5 and 6 nights a week or loads of different opponents,
Right.
or if you were a young wrestler, getting to wrestle older wrestlers who've been wrestling 10 or 20 years and knew lots of different ways of doing things and tricks and taught you out, and you just picked it up from them. And so when I came here, there was, if I wrestled Bobby Eaton, or I wrestled Arn Anderson, or I wrestled Ricky Steamboat, or Ric Flair, or Brad Armstrong, or Paul Orndorff, or whoever, never any problem. Larry Zbyszko, never any problem. I just did my stuff, they did their stuff, and we reacted accordingly. At that time, though, was the time when there was people going and saying, you can be a wrestler because you're a bodybuilder and you can be a wrestler. And most of your skill set is just a clothesline. And then it was having to work round people. So I had a skill set that I'd been taught from the people who taught me. of how to make people look like they could wrestle, whether they could wrestle or not. That was one of my jobs from 20 to 24, was to travel all around the world to different places because of people, the people, I know exactly who the people were. It was Terry Rudge, Pete Roberts, and Dave Taylor. And they were the traveling heavyweights of Britain at the time. There's Tony Sinclair as well, and then different people in Europe. But they were Dave, Pete, and Terry were the traveling heavyweights, which they used to call them international heavyweights. And you would be brought into these different territories in different countries to make their wrestlers look more credible. And it was a skill set of making them look like they can do things they can't do and look in the part. And so I could wrestle anybody and put them in different things. What was a problem was when I got here, Bill Watts brought me here, and I'm very grateful to that. But when I got here, he would say, and not just Bill, this was I was getting a lot of voices, a 24-year-old who'd been really, I couldn't have had, I had the greatest teachers in the world and the greatest opponents, right? And I came here, and then my first night, it was, okay, you go and wrestle this fella for 3 minutes. Pardon? 3 minutes? You can't do wrestling in 3 minutes.
Right,
You
right.
have to, it tells a story. And I said, I've never done anything less than 15 minutes or 5 rounds. There used to be a lot of rounds in Europe. And I remember the actual group the first day with Barry Windham, Mike Graham, Bill Watts, Greg Gagne, Dusty Rhodes. And every single one of them had been somewhere where there'd been a British wrestler, Billy Robinson, Tony Charles, Les Thornton, etc., Lord Alfred Hayes, etc., who wrestled us. They're all saying, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this? Yeah, I can do that. But you need the people to do it with.
Right.
Or the people who know how to react and not act. And if you're doing a certain move, there was also a thing that I had a problem with, was because there was a lot of those people I've mentioned who came from Britain who'd ironed a few people out. And that's a polite way of saying creamed a few people.
Right, right.
And so for whatever reason, the style that I wrestled, it took me about 6 months to calm all the wrestlers down that, no, just because I do something a little different, I'm not going to break your arm. Right? Because I don't do a wrist lock like that, which everybody did when I came out. I don't know what that is.
Right.
Right? The only people you saw do proper wrist locks were Ric Flair and Bret Hart, or if you watched old Dory Funk matches. And if you ask them, it's because they were trained by British wrestlers. But if you will see most people doing that. I don't know what that is. You do that to me, you can't do any.
And for the people listening, you're holding up your hands like in a circle.
Yes.
Combining your hands in a circle, and you're saying this is not the way that you were shown.
No, I was told to put on proper wrist locks where I can just, with 2 fingers, put you on the floor like that.
Right.
And again, you'd see Ric Flair, I'd see him doing it, but most people just grabbed thumb on the top of the arm. But it was just the way it was here. That was what it was. They didn't sort of do the stuff that I did. But it didn't matter if Ricky Steamboat did that to me. I could react accordingly, and and it didn't matter because any of the people that I mentioned before, Brad and Arn and Bobby and anybody, and Brian Pillman, because Brian Pillman had been to Calgary. Well, Calgary was always a mixture of Japanese guys and European guys, as well as the American guys and Canadian guys. So you just learned to do. You just go everywhere and anywhere, and you could wrestle anybody. So there was no WCW style. That was something that was later coined about WWE. There's a WWE style. There was no WCW style. It was just American style wrestling. I didn't have a problem with any of the fellas that knew what they were doing. I learned over time not to trust a lot of people when they would say, if I like, that's another thing wrestlers say. How long have you been wrestling? And, oh, 10 years. I take, wait, 10 years of my career, which was then, I'd had, probably nearly 2,000 matches
It's a whole
in
different thing than
in
now.
19 countries, right? With the best of the best and wrestling Fit Finlay and Rollerball Rocco when I was 18 and being around, you know, Tony Sinclair and all and Dave Taylor and Pete Roberts and Johnny Saint and then like training with him as well and Marty Jones teaching me as my trainer, who was like the best British wrestler, of his period. So it was just learning to what I could and couldn't do with certain people, but also learning that how long have you been wrestling? 10 years. How many matches have you had? Is what thing I learned after very quickly. Oh, truthfully, how many matches? Oh, well, I've had 50 matches, right? 50 matches. So I know I'll just keep it to headlocks and tackle and certain things. And that was a figuring out period of what I could and couldn't do with certain people or them, Bill Watts or whoever saying, oh, can you do that thing that such and such did? Yeah, I can do it. And then saying to the person I was on with at first,
Right.
can you do that? And, oh, yeah, of course I can. And then me doing it and them having no idea how to take it
Right.
and going the wrong way or not taking the right kind of a fall for it, which made, if you take a bad bump for somebody, doesn't make you look bad. It makes the person throwing you look bad, like they can't throw you properly. So it was a figuring out process of what I could and couldn't do with certain people. And some people, it was just strikes. I'd just do strikes because that's all they could do. And some
Mm.
people I could move around and wrestle more. So that's basically that.